What's up, and welcome to another episode of Movie Pitch Mondays. This is a show where I pitch hypothetical movies. And if you don't know who I am, I'm Edward Mullen. I'm an author, I'm a vlogger, a YouTuber, podcaster, and some other things. So in today's video, I'm going to be pitching the movie of Socrates, one of my heroes. And I'm always curious to know why there's not a Socrates movie. And if I had to guess, I would assume it's because he doesn't really do anything that exciting. He just basically talks and philosophizes, and other than me and maybe some hardcore fans are, gonna go to it or gonna appreciate it. So I'm gonna try to do my best to pitch a really exciting and entertaining Socrates movie. So for those who don't know, Socrates was a Greek philosopher. He was born in Athens in Greece in 470 BC, and he was hugely influential in Western thought and Western philosophy. And he had a disciple in Plato, and Plato had a disciple in Aristotle, and Aristotle was, the mentor to Alexander the Great. So that's kind of how they all fit in. So what you might not know is that we don't actually know that much about Socrates' life. Most of what we know is from his students, Plato being the most prolific. So Plato wrote these things called dialogues, which is basically a conversation style, almost like a short story, philosophical inquiry, and Socrates was like the main character. And so we don't necessarily know if these were Socrates' actual words or if they're just, he was just a character in, Plato's works. There is some theory behind that, which I won't go into. What I can tell you is that he had a father who was a stonemason and a sculptor. His mother was a midwife. He was married. He had 3 kids. And, his appearance has been described. He's very kind of stout, bald, kind of a stubby nose, stocky figure. He later died, in his 70s with a famous, kind of drinking of poisonous hemlock. He wasn't really involved in his sons' lives and spent most of his times philosophizing with, teaching young Athens boys. And he didn't really work, although it could be assumed that he, because he comes from a family of, sculptor and a midwife, he wouldn't be that rich. So it's likely that he was, educated by, a traditional Greek education, and then likely took on his father's craft, working as a mason or working as a sculptor. There are references to Socrates living in poverty. Plato mentions it, that he doesn't accept payment for philosophizing, and he kind of is poor. So these are some of the things that we know based on, what we know from some of his students, Plato being, like I mentioned, the most prolific. So my movie would basically tell the life story of Socrates. So I wouldn't suspect there to be a sequel. I'd basically try to tell his entire life in 2 hours. Obviously, most people know, it's not a surprise that he died very famously drinking hemlock, poisonous hemlock. And the reason he did that is because he was brought to trial, and he was later convicted by 501 Athenians. Some of the charges that were brought against him were corrupting the youth and not believing in the city's gods, and impiety and such by this prosecutor named Miletus. And so the whole story, my movie would basically work up to the ultimate conclusion of his death. But how I would do it, I would kind of weave it in, because I don't want the entire third act to be, just the trial and the death. I would probably work it in splices like they did in The Social Network. So if you remember The Social Network, we had Mark Zuckerberg. We would see kind of his early kind of childhood life with starting Facebook, not childhood, but college life, starting Facebook, dating and all this kind of stuff. And then interspliced in between that would be, the trial with him and Eduardo. So I would do the same thing. So I'd break up the trial, and all these kind of pivotal moments in his life, I would put in, trial moments. And then in the third act, we'd kind of see the conclusion of the trial and then the death. So this is how my Socrates movie would go. So for those of you who don't know, this is my cat Socrates, and he was upstairs napping, and he's come down to join me. So he might meow in the background as I go through some of this. Okay, so I don't think it'd be very interesting to start the movie with him being born. I think the first time we see him, he was going to be like 10 or 11. He's in school, and I'm not necessarily sure what school looks like in Athens. It doesn't really matter, but like do they have like parent-teacher interviews, that kind of thing. I don't know. But anyway, so I think it's going to be very obvious that he is much smarter than the other kids. And obviously he's going to be a little bit unattractive, maybe a little chubby or whatnot. And maybe the kids are picking on him, and he challenges the teacher in like the opening scene. The teacher says something, and then he kind of challenges her, that typical Socrates fashion, where he's, having this kind of Socratic dialogue, or the Socratic method, where he's challenging the teacher, and he gets into trouble. And then maybe the teacher talks to, sends him, I don't know if there wouldn't be a principal's office, but to some equivalent of that, where, he gets in trouble, and maybe the teacher talks to his parents, and then, Socrates is kind of getting scolded at home. So he's going to be talking to his mom, be like, "Mom, why don't the other boys like me?" It's like, "Because you're different, Socrates." It's like, "What do you mean?" It's like, you've been given a gift, and I think you're gonna, people will remember your name. You're not like the other boys. You're different. And so he's like, "Well, what do you mean? How do you know?" He's like, "Call it a mother's intuition." And he's like, "What do you mean by mother's intuition? Do other mothers have other intuitions? And so how do I know if your intuition is correct?" And he basically starts grilling her, right? Like right off the bat. And so we can see early on, this is kind of in his character, to pester people and bug them with questions and really try to seek truth, right? And the dad will be like, "Stop asking so many questions." And then he'll be like, "Well, how will I have knowledge if I don't ask questions? Like, there's things I don't know, and I come to you guys because I think you know the answers, so naturally I'd ask you questions," right? Now, for those of you who know Socrates, you'll know that he grows up to be exactly this. He pesters people and asks people things. He, seeks common people and really wise, prominent people like judges and lawyers and doctors, and really asks them seemingly like simple questions, and then forces them to kind of draw a conclusion, and then he shows that conclusion doesn't follow, and it kind of makes them appear foolish. So a lot of people don't like him for that. So I would kind of show that in his childhood, where he's similarly doing that. And so the next scene would be, him. I would also want to show kind of like his courage or his bravery. So maybe he likes a girl at school and she disses him because, maybe he's not that attractive, and some other boys tease him, and then he kind of takes a backseat, doesn't really engage. And then he's like, "You know what?" And then he just undresses them in like a verbal like warfare and just breaks them down. And you can see he's like very good with his logic and his words, and he just destroys these kids who are like, 10 or 11. So I think that'd be like a really powerful moment. And maybe there's another scene where he does form a friendship, and, he has to like come to that friend's aid and like beat them up or something like that. I'd like to show that like courage of him. So then later we see Socrates, he's, having dinner, he's washing up, and later, he's reading books by maybe like Heraclitus or, Pythagoras or something like that. I don't even know if they had books back then, but like, I don't know, I'd try to work in some like Heraclitus or, some kind of great thinkers or great minds that came before him. I don't know, I'd probably kind of stick that in somewhere. And so the next thing I'd do is I'd flash forward, do a court scene. It'd be like mid-trial, or maybe, beginning of the trial. I don't know, some crucial point that maybe mirrors, what's happening in his childhood. So it's like, you ask too many questions, and, you make people look like a fool or whatever, which is what we just saw as a kid. So he's basically hasn't changed, essentially. And he's now an old man, 70 years old, sitting in court, and he's just waiting for his turn. So that scene would just be, Miletus kind of attacking Socrates. Okay, so I'd flash forward, maybe he's a teenager or a young man. He's kind of foregoing monetary pursuits. He's not getting a job. There's a lot of leisure time. He's sitting around eating grapes, maybe getting a little bit fat. His parents are bugging him to like, do something with his life. And he's like, "No, I am doing something with my life. I'm philosophizing." And they're like, "What is philosophy?" Right? And I mean, well, they might know, but he's basically laying the groundwork of the grassroots of philosophy. And we kind of see him piecing together some of these early things. And maybe he's making a mockery of people. He's going around town asking questions. And this, has a lot of kids kind of like idolizing him. Like they're snickering him. They think it's funny to see, this kind of young man completely embarrass a judge or somebody who's really important, right? So Socrates is developing kind of a name for himself, developing a little bit of a following, and he starts teaching the youth his philosophy. And one of those youths would be Plato. And so he's kind of, a standout student, and he's following Socrates around, scribbling in his notepad. And then I'd show that scene, and then maybe slice back to another scene of like the courtroom drama. We flash forward. The next time we come back, we see, Socrates as, maybe a little bit older. Like I mentioned, the political climate changes in Athens. There's the Peloponnesian War. And we do know Socrates was drafted into the war, and Athenian law required every able-bodied man to go to war. So we do know Socrates was on the front line with like a sword, or not a sword, like a spear and a shield and a mask. I'd put on, like, if it was up to me, I'd put on a little bit of muscle on him and have him do some like badass shit, like some other like acts of heroism or bravery. Maybe he like sticks up for a buddy, or he like knocks people over or picks them up and slams them or something. Like, show him being a little bit of a badass. I think that'd be cool. So, we're seeing him, going around town, philosophizing, kind of building a following, mentoring these kids. Plato, whose real name is Aristocles. He's like, my friends, or people call me Plato, because Plato actually, I think it comes from Platon, which is a Greek word that means broad. And I think people said that because he had a broad head. And so maybe he's like, the kids make fun of me based on the way I look, which is exactly what kids did to Socrates. So Socrates kind of feels for this kid, and he's like, okay, well, I'll call you Plato, or whatever you like to be called, right? And so yeah, I think that'd be a kind of cool moment to see that early bond with Socrates and Plato. Okay, so the next time we see Socrates, he's a little bit older. He has a wife and 3 kids, and very tumultuous relationship. From what we know in history, is that he didn't really spend a lot of time with his wife and his 3 boys. I think his wife was even mentioned as undesirable. That's not in Plato's works, that's in somebody else's work. So, I think he spends a lot of time philosophizing, and he's not taking jobs, which maybe they're in poverty, and the wife is kind of getting at him a bit like that. Like, hey, you should do something with your life. You should, get a job or whatever. And Socrates is like, no, I don't need that, right? And so, it's not really clear what he does for money. Maybe some of the boys maybe give him money or something. I know that there is some discretion. I think Plato mentions that he doesn't do that, but I don't know. Maybe I'd put in something like that, or he has rich friends that kind of support him or whatever. So I think this point of the movie, we see some like, some classic Socrates. I'd do some of the famous, dialogues, like, the symposium, and, I can't remember some of the other names, but there's one where he goes and talks to the sophist. The sophist comes to town, which, by the way, I talk about on a podcast. I do 2 Socrates podcasts. I'll link those in the description. But anyway, it's like this really badass sophist. And sophist is just somebody who kind of uses their words and like gives speeches and stuff like that. So this sophist comes to town, and he thinks he's kind of a badass, and he's like this smart guy. And everyone's like, Socrates, this sophist is in town. Like, you should go challenge him. And Socrates is like, just like walking in a garden. He's like, all right, yeah, show me where he is. And I love that moment. It's like a very kind of Batman-y moment where he's like, yeah, sure, I'll take this guy on. So he goes up by himself and just takes on their entire crew and just completely destroys them. Yeah, it's one of my favorite ones. I can't remember what it's called, but I'll link to it in the description. So maybe we see a scene with Plato talking to his parents, and his parents like, look, I don't want you to be hanging out with this old man, this Socrates guy. I think he's bad. He's corrupting you, right? He's like, no, he's not corrupting me. He's teaching me. He's like, no. I forbid you to hang out with them. So there's like maybe a little bit of tension there. And we see Plato, he idolizes this guy. Maybe as he's scribbling in his notebook, he hears Socrates' voice in his head, and he's kind of writing stuff down, forming kind of like the grassroots of these dialogues that he'll later produce, right? So he's kind of listening back in his head. We hear Socrates' voice, and he's kind of scribbling at night, trying to like do his best to remember what Socrates said. So then Socrates is, going around town. He's asking in this kind of inquiry, question answering style, not seemingly getting any closer to getting like true knowledge or wisdom. He's like, these people don't know anything. So he goes to the Oracle of Delphi, or Delphi, I don't know how to pronounce it, I've only read the word. So he goes up to this oracle, which is like a prophet, some like really, wise person that kind of knows the future and knows everything. So he goes to this oracle and says, I'm looking for the wisest man. Tell me who that is so I can approach them and ask them questions, because I seek answers. And the oracle looks at Socrates and goes, Socrates, you are the wisest man. He goes, me? How could I be the wisest man? I don't know anything. I'm ignorant. He goes, no, but that's just it, Socrates. Everybody out here is ignorant, but they don't know it. They think they know stuff, but they don't know stuff. You don't know anything, but you also don't know that you know anything. So that actually puts you ahead of everybody else. That makes you the wisest person. Okay, so in the third act, we see Socrates kind of doing his thing, and, he's getting arrested. He's brought to court. We see the beginning of the trial. And it's a big deal. Socrates has kind of built a name for himself, and everybody, word is spreading very quickly, right? And everyone's like, leaving their job. There's like shoe cobblers, and there's, carpenters and horse trainers, and everyone's just like, hearing the news from like, little kids running around like, hey, did you hear Socrates got arrested? He's being, tried. So everyone's tuning in. This is like this big event, and we see the beginnings of the trial, right? And Socrates is just kind of, sitting by himself. He's chosen to represent himself, and this is no big deal. He's been in 1,000 kind of debates, and this will be no different, right? So because we've seen the trial throughout the movie, it's been spliced in, we don't necessarily need to go through the whole trial. We maybe do like the opening speech, and then we'll see like Miletus talking. Miletus is the lawyer. He's like the counsel, like, what's it called? Like the, what's it called when like there's the defender, and then he's like the prosecutor, right? So he's prosecuting Socrates, and then so maybe we see a scene of him like conspiring with some officials, or maybe there's some bribery, or there's some underhandedness going on, right? Meanwhile, Plato's in the background. He's kind of recording everything. So he's scribbling in his notepad, and again, he's kind of hearing Socrates' voice in his head, and he's doing his best to capture everything that he's seeing. And for those of you who don't know, there's a famous Plato dialogue, perhaps the most famous. It's called the Apology, which is basically this entire courtroom drama. And actually, I do a podcast where I go through the entire court scene, and then the aftermath, which is the Crito, where he's in jail. So I do both of those podcasts. I'll link to those in the description. But we know Plato was at the trial, or at least we can assume he was at the trial, and he recorded everything. So I would show a young Plato kind of scribbling and making notes. I just think that would be a kind of a cool nod to the Plato's Apology. The next time we see Socrates, he's in court. He's, it's near the end of the trial. There's some closing speeches. Socrates gives this like brilliant closing speech. It seems convincing. He's our hero, so we're buying it. We love it. And then they go to a vote. I think there's 501 Athenians who cast. They all get up one by one, and they cast like a black rock in either Socrates' bucket or like Miletus' bucket, and then they count them all up, and that's basically like a trial by your peers, right? So one by one, people are dropping these stones, and then they add them all up. And if I remember correctly, I believe it was like 51% to 49% in favor of Miletus. So Socrates is convicted, guilty of the charges of like corrupting the youth and impiety and not believing the city's gods. And, maybe there's some other charges. Those are the ones I can remember. And so then there's another sequence where they figure out, okay, well, now you're convicted. What do we do with you? I think Miletus is pushing for... I can't remember what he's pushing for, but anyway, there's the choice of being like exiled, which is to be removed from Athens and be sent to an island somewhere or some other place, and you can no longer be step foot in Athens. And then there's like imprisonment, lifelong imprisonment, and then there's like the death penalty. So after Socrates kind of goes through all these options, I think he's a little bit cocky. If this is my memory serving me correctly, I think he's a little bit cocky and arrogant, and he kind of makes a mockery of the whole thing. And, he says like, you can kill me, but you'll never kill philosophy, because I don't represent philosophy. Philosophy is an idea. that's in the mind of all these youths. So you actually kill me, you make a martyr out of me, philosophy grows stronger, right? So after Socrates gives his speech, the Athenians, you know, like the people, the jury, vote again. And if I remember correctly, I think they like unanimously, like a huge majority say, yeah, death penalty, because you've made a mockery and you're pissing people off and you've kind of reminded us why, like how annoying you are. So yeah, you're dead. So then he goes, yeah, okay, fine. So that's like a really sad moment. You know, the youth of him are like crying and he's got maybe a little bit of a smug face. He's like, yeah, whatever. I don't care. I'm old man. I've lived a good life. So the next scene, he's in jail. This is a famous scene in, you know, Plato's dialogues called the Crito. And Crito refers to his buddy Crito, who's actually a really wealthy man. So Crito and his homies go to the prison to kind of talk to Socrates one last time and actually convince him to escape the prison. And Crito's reasoning is like, look, man, I have a lot of money. I can pay off all these guards, no problem. And actually I can take you and I can move you someplace else. I can set you up with a house. I can give you living expenses and money. You'll be taken care of. You'll eat like a king. You'll live like a king. In fact, I can ship your family out there. You'll have a good life and you can live out the rest of your life on some island somewhere. And if I don't do that, people are going to like pass judgment on me because they know I'm rich. They know I could have done that. And so if you die, they'll think, well, why didn't you save Socrates? You had the money. Why didn't you just bribe the guards? So he's like, Socrates, it'll look bad on me. You have to do it, right? So then Socrates kind of does what he's been doing as a kid. He's like, well, look, Crito, you know, do we care about everybody's opinion or just the people's opinion that matter? You know, if you're building a house, you don't trust the doctor's opinion or, you know, the poet's opinion. You trust the carpenter's opinion, right? And if you're, you know, grooming a horse, you don't trust every opinion. You just trust the horse groomer's opinion. And he's like, yeah, that's true. But like, you know, opinions matter, Socrates. The opinions of the people are the precise reason why you're in jail right now. Like, what are you talking about? So at the end of it, they kind of go back and forth and Socrates, you know, outwits him and try to, you know, he's like, all right, man, I guess like whatever, just if that's what you want to do with your life, then just take this hemlock. So Socrates takes this like poisonous hemlock, which is like this plant, and they make it into a drink, and he drinks it and he dies. And it's a very sad scene. And this kind of is the ending of the movie, and it's very kind of somber, and there's music playing, and you know, people are really hanging their heads low. Their friend, their hero, their mentor has now died. So Socrates is dead, and it's the end of the movie. I would have like, you know, a panning shot where it slowly pulls away, shows the kind of city, shows the Acropolis, and, you know, there's sad music, and then it maybe goes off into like, you know, a sunset or whatever, and it just fades to black, and then credits roll up, and then show the credits, the director and the writer, and blah, 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 blah. And then there'd be a bonus scene, and it would have kind of like a dark room, candle lit, and it'll have young Plato scribbling in his book, and he'll be hearing the voice of Socrates, and it'll be echoing what he kind of said in the trial. He goes, you know, you can kill me, but you'll never kill philosophy. So when I said this was a standalone movie, I lied. It's going to be a trilogy, and the sequel is going to be all about Plato's life, and the third movie is going to be all about Aristotle's life. And if you really wanted to get crazy, I would redo the Alexander the Great story, and that would kind of be my homage, my tribute to Socrates and some of the heroes that I kind of respect. So there it is. That's my Socrates movie pitch. Let me know in the comments if you liked it. If you have any other ideas that maybe we could make this movie better, let me know. And if you liked the video, please hit the like button. If you want to see more videos where I talk about writing and I do movie pitches, hit the subscribe button, and I will see you next time.